Welcome to another episode of The Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated and informed property buyer. I'm your host, David Johnston, and I'm joined as always by my buddies Cate Bakos and Mike Mortlock. This week, Cate has poured through ABS data and we're going to chat all things social housing, supply, policies, inefficiencies, and some of the ideas out there which are aimed to solve our social housing problems. If only it was that simple, though. Cate, how about we start with the basics? What is social housing?
Yeah, social housing is government subsidised short and long-term rental housing. And in Australia in recent decades, it's mainly been available to people on very low incomes and who often have experienced either homelessness, family violence, or have other complex needs. And it's made up of two of the following types of housing. First is public housing, which is owned and managed by the state and territory governments. And the second is community housing, which is managed and often owned by not-for-profit organisations. Now, social housing differs from private rental in that housing is allocated according to need rather than by households competing in a market. Social housing provides housing for people who are very unlikely to afford private rental market rents in most areas, and these people would usually find it difficult to be accepted into private rental due to a need for medical, age-related or other forms of support as well. So we are talking about, a lot of vulnerable people. It provides people with homes where they can live with dignity and as comfortably as possible. And as an added benefit for the wider society, it helps reduce people's use of expensive health and judicial services. So for some people, social housing provides a place where they can rebuild their lives, acquire education skills and access employment opportunities. And that absolutely explains why so many of our higher density social housing towers and clusters of residential developments are in such great places. They're near cities, they're near stations, employment and opportunity. That's what it's all about.
It's interesting to note also, if we look at, say, public housing versus community housing, the government has really preferenced the community housing and kind of deprioritised the public housing. So in 2023, 67% of social housing was public housing, and community, if you add the Indigenous stuff, we're talking, the difference 33 in total. But public housing numbers have declined over time from 341,000 public units in 2006 down to 298 in 2023, whereas community housing rose from just 30,000 in 2006 to over 112,000 in 2022. So that's an interesting thing to observe. The government is actually preferring to offer these grants to community housing providers, which maybe begs the question, do they believe they're more efficient at providing this housing? Maybe that's something we can unpack later. But Cate, where does crisis accommodation fit into this?
Just quickly, Mike, and we'll get back. But can you just explain to our listeners what's the difference? What is community housing?
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially it's the administrator that's the real difference. So public housing is owned by the government, whereas community housing is they get grants of their community housing providers. And, there's regional ones, there's state-specific ones, there's national ones. So here in Newcastle, we have Compass Housing, for example. There's a different housing provider on the Central Coast, and they're doing some innovative things with landlords that can actually rent to community housing as sort of like the head tenant. So that's the real difference. It's government versus, privately administered with government grants normally.
Okay. I think it's all about the capital, Dave. It's so expensive to physically just go and buy a property. Yeah. We often find in our searches when we're looking at ownership on our system that a lot of these social housing properties are owned by, it might be Salvation Army, or so they've got a definite ownership structure there where the government hasn't acquired them. I think, from a bang for buck kind of point of view, the government being able to chip in with grants or support or whatever it might be in tax deductions, that's a far more cost-effective way to contribute to social housing for the government than to just outright go and buy a building.
And as I mentioned as well, like there's opportunities for community housing where no one actually owns that as part of either the government or the community housing provider. So they might have a developer that they have community housing has an agreement with. You're building 20 units in this little complex. Give us 4 of them as the head lease, and then we'll have an ownership over that. We'll have, some special things in the contract to replace, the carpets and cover any damage. So the upfront capital cost is not really big, because you're right, Cate, like that's the big impost, right? Is the cost of owning that rather than actually administering it.
That's right.
And so, Cate, where does crisis accommodation fit in?
Social housing does differ from crisis accommodation in that it provides longer term and secure rental housing. Crisis accommodation provides safe temporary housing for individuals and families in immediate need due to various circumstances. It's a crucial lifeline for those experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. And it can range from emergency shelters, youth refuges, or transitional housing. And many crisis accommodation providers offer support services as well, like case management, advocacy, counselling. And crisis accommodation is often targeted towards specific groups, including women and children experiencing family violence, older people, young people, and those with mental health issues. And it's organisations like the Salvation Army, Mission Australia, Australian Red Cross, etc., that provide this type of accommodation, Dave.
Okay, and so let's talk about the rent for social housing. Obviously, most people are probably aware that the rent is subsidised, which is what makes it so affordable. But how is this calculated? How is that determined?
Buckle in. I had to read and reread to understand this, because there are all kinds of formulas and models here, but I've simplified it as best I can. They're set with different considerations in mind, firstly. So when they're setting the rents, it depends on whether the dwelling's public housing or community housing. Public housing rents are calculated at 25 to 30% of the household's income, and that depends on the household income and composition. So, how many dependents, etc. In Victoria, for example, rebated rent is calculated as 25% of the household's primary income plus 15% of any family-related payments. So we've now got to grapple with the concept of rebates, and that's how this system works. So the market rent is what the property would rent for in the private market, and market rents are set by an independent valuer. Many public housing renters pay rebated rent, though. They receive a rental rebate which reduces the market rent to make the rent more affordable. And it all happens at the same time. It's not like they pay their full rent and then they get rebated at the end of the year. The amount that they pay is less the rebate. So rebated rent, or the weekly payment amount, is the rent that the renters actually pay after the rebate's taken off the market rent. And to determine the rebated rental amount, the household's income is divided into assessable and non-assessable income. And it's only the assessable income that's used when determining this rebate. Assessable income includes their primary income, such as wages, salaries, pensions, benefits, allowances, superannuation, lump sum payments, interest from savings, or income from investments. It also includes family-related payments like family tax benefits paid by Centrelink, child maintenance paid by either a child support agency or a non-custodial parent. Non-assessable income, which doesn't count towards, is carers' allowances, pharmaceutical or mobility allowances. So there's a bit there to take into account, and obviously the rebate varies based on all of these things.
Yeah, okay. So ballpark, it's often around 25 to 30% of the household's income.
Yep.
And if it's family-related payments such as family tax benefits, Centrelink, etc., it's often a bit lower percentage in that space of about 15%.
Yes.
And your general sort of add-on allowances, they don't get factored into your income.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Mike, I'll ask you to detail how rent is treated for community housing.
Yeah, so for community housing, it's the 25 to 30% of the income rent rate, once again, depending on the household income and the composition of that income, as Cate elucidated. It's applied only to very low income tenants, as community housing tenants are also eligible for the Commonwealth Rent Assistance. That subsidy will be paid to the community housing provider directly, resulting in a rent that may approach local area market rents. The ATO has ruled that as charities, GST will not apply to not-for-profit community housing providers that charge rent, so that's obviously a help to them. So that they've got to be charging rents that are less than 75% of local market rents, of course, to qualify for that. So as a consequence, in such situations, community housing providers charge rents at 74.9% or below market rents normally.
Yeah, okay. So that makes sense. So, Cate, we often hear the term affordable housing, but how is it actually defined?
Yeah, it's a much less precise exercise because in Australia it doesn't have a common meaning across our states and territories and government programs. For some
There's part of the
jurisdictions,
problem.
it is, yeah. It's not clearly defined nationally. For some jurisdictions, affordability may be defined based on a household's ability to pay, determined by the household's income, but for others it might be defined as a housing rent or price that's lower than the prevailing local market. Some jurisdictions refer to rental housing only. For others, it includes home ownership as well as rental. Just to add to the confusion.
Yeah. From a generic sense, the best we've got, I think, is the 30-40 rule, which often gets misquoted in the media. So what they're talking about is that where costs are considered affordable, they only consume less than 30% of a household's gross income when that household is in the bottom 40% of the income distribution. So if we think about the bottom 40% of income earners, they can only spend 30% of that income on housing for it to be affordable. So when we see those, the Anglicare and the other, affordability studies, that's the metric that they use. And that's, to me, that's actually a really, really low number. So those numbers are always going to be high, that, the percentage of affordable, private rental accommodation is 3% or something like that. But that seems to be the main kind of yardstick. But as you say, Cate, it differs, and that adds to the confusion.
It does indeed.
So you're saying that 40% of the population could potentially fit into affordable housing? You said the bottom 40% of income earners?
Well, it's just making a line in the sand to say affordable housing only is when the bottom 40% of income earners spend 30% or less of that income on their housing costs.
Australia is facing an escalating housing crisis. We know we are not building enough properties to keep up with the demand and our population growth. And social housing certainly seems to be a big part of both the problem and a potential solution. Social housing, comprising public and community housing, plays a critical role in ensuring secure, affordable housing, as we've been speaking about so far in today's episode. But it seems as though there's been decades of underinvestment. We've got policy fragmentation with different definitions around what social housing is from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And on the surface, with the cost of living crisis, it would appear that we have a rising demand as well, which is straining the system further. So how about we start with some numbers here, Cate? Can you shed some light on the number of social housing properties in Australia?
Indeed. Australia's social housing stock has stagnated relative to population growth. And following our most recent census data collection in 2021, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, around 4% of all housing in Australia is social housing. And this figure has remained static or declined proportionally since the 1990s. Demand, however, has continued to rise. As of 2023, over 170,000 households were on wait lists for public housing, with many facing a wait time of several years.
Yeah, so that's not going to be a fun place to be, being on a wait list for public housing assistance for many years. So it does sound like the issues and challenges have increased over the decades. And this is despite our average standard of living rising significantly over this period of time, with Australia one of the wealthiest nations per capita in the world, usually around first or second on that measure. So how do we end up with such a dichotomy of fortunes for people's living situations across the country, Mike? We know that several factors have amplified this issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few things that have exacerbated it. The increased housing costs, of course, hasn't necessarily helped. Stagnant wages, although, we've had some recent increases in the last little while for a lot of low-income earners. There's not a lot of room to move. An expanding population is obviously a big one. So we've had quite a lot of international migration, and that has put some pressure on the private rental market. And, some of these people may have been able to survive in the private rental market, but then when we see double-digit rent growth changes, then that sort of maybe pushes them into the social housing side of things. So outside of that, the existing housing stock is aging and in poor condition. We've got like a 95% occupancy rate. So really we're running at 100% if you allow for maintenance and changeover and those sorts of things. So it is something that I feel like the government's dropped the ball on, and particularly for individuals with disabilities, families, the elderly, there's just not enough to go around, and we're still sitting at approximately 120,000 people homeless as well. So you add that into the mix, there's nowhere near enough housing to support what we need to keep people safe and away from harm.
I'm alarmed just hearing you talk about existing social housing stock that's aging. And I see this firsthand myself all the time when I'm out on my travels. It's alarming because I actually see abandoned public housing properties, boards on the windows and grass up to your knees. Never okay to see stock that our government owns that's just sitting there rotting, going to waste with no one getting any benefit from it. And the question is, should they sell it off into the private market and reinvest the money, or should they throw some money at it and fix it up? Either way, it shouldn't be sitting there doing nothing, just on the balance sheet. I get upset about that. Some of these properties, I was in Knoxfield just last week and saw exactly that. And I thought to myself, having assessed properties in the area, that would have been worth circa 1.2 million just sitting there. So I think it's an indictment on our state government when we see this, and it's not one or two here and there. There are estates that have issues, and I've been to Wendouree West in Ballarat, and there are several houses in a row in streets that are boarded up and doing nothing. So I wonder just how internally broken our government housing ministry is when I spot houses like this.
Yeah, contrast that to private landlords. Like, what percentage of these derelict abandoned homes would be public versus private? I mean, private individuals typically can't afford to have a property that's not producing income, but apparently we taxpayers
they pay land tax. Yeah, that's right. I think it's not good. It's a real indictment.
So with this underutilisation of government properties, there are many in disrepair. We have a large waiting list. Can we get to work out what sort of numbers do we need? Do we think, Mike, how much social housing are we, do we need to be able to put a roof over everyone's head who are in these difficult circumstances?
It's hard to know the exact number, but it's easy to understand that number is more than what we have, right? So the 2021 census recorded there are almost 350,000 social housing dwellings across Australia, which is about 4% of the number of all households. At the end of June 21, there was another almost 165,000 applicants on the waiting list for public housing, and more than 40,000 applicants for community housing, and just over 12,000 applicants for state-owned and managed Indigenous housing. And if we add that all together, all the households on the waiting list and those already in social housing, we're talking, more than 500,000. So, we're just under 4%, and already those numbers get us at 6%. Australian households were living in or had requested to live in a formal social housing. So, that's broadly the start of where we need to be. The AHURI research has projected growth in demand for social housing to the year 2037, estimating that over 1.1 million social dwellings will be needed by that point. So,
Wow.
we're somewhere around about, 3x would probably be a much healthier point to be.
Yeah. Okay. So that's certainly a lot of housing. Thanks, Mike. It exceeds our housing accord vision substantially, and this is just social housing. We haven't even factored in affordable housing. Cate has prepped some charts and tables on this, and they'll be captured in the show notes, showing the level of unmet demand and where we need to get to by 2037. Cate, how does Australia rate on the world stage in terms of the percentage of the population who we assist with social housing?
Yeah, when we contrast them, we sit at 4.4% with the OECD average at 6.9%. We are in the heart of the bell curve though, so we could certainly gain a lot by considering how some of the other nations balance social housing. Australia's level of social housing in 2020 was low in comparison with the UK, which sat at 17%, and quite a few countries within the European Union, an average of almost 8%. But varying from the 34% in the Netherlands to less than 1% in Lithuania, we're comparable to Canada, New Zealand, and the US, which are all just under 4% respectively.
Yeah, so that's a really broad mix there, isn't it?
Is it ever? I don't know how Netherlands do it. I mean, that would be a fascinating conversation.
The Dutchies are firing, aren't they? What's going on there?
I guess on one level, but then you could also consider, does that cause a much larger percentage of their population to retire with less wealth because a third of the population, it's to, need support from their government to have a roof over their head. We know there's a big correlation between owning your own home and having a higher standard of living in retirement. So there's obviously a point where I would imagine it can become too much and harmful to your society, but it would appear we are at a level that's probably lower. And, we want to be a nation that facilitates, helps people create opportunities for themselves. Notwithstanding, there's obviously, there's a percentage of the population who are going to be in dire circumstances that need assistance. So, yeah, it's a real differential, isn't it? 34% right down to 0.4% in the Czech Republic.
Colombia's at 0.
Oh, Colombia! Yeah, I didn't see that. That's tough.
Tough.
Yeah. Let's now chat about government policies and their impact, Cate. What can you share with us there?
Social housing policy in Australia is governed by a complex mix of federal, state and territory responsibilities. That will always create a bit of a challenge, won't it, when you've got all of these different jurisdictions. Over recent decades, the Commonwealth has progressively reduced its direct role in housing provision, shifting the responsibilities to the states and territories through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. While this framework provides funding, it does lack enforceable national standards or targets for new housing development. And I think that's a serious problem, and it's certainly a contributing factor to the root cause, lack of investment. Policy inconsistencies and a lack of long-term commitment have led us to this patchwork system with varied outcomes. And in some jurisdictions, such as Victoria, ambitious state-level investments are being made. So, for example, our $5.3 billion big housing build, while in others progress is slower. And compounding these challenges is the reliance on short-term funding cycles that undermine the long-term planning and investment in housing infrastructure that we need.
That's a great overview, Cate. And Mike, can you step us through some inefficiencies and structural issues?
Yeah, I mean, government-run things. How could there be inefficiencies is my first question, Dave. I mean, how dare you? Where's the evidence? I think we'll start with underfunding and disrepair. So a chronic underfunding has led to maintenance backlogs and the deterioration of existing properties, and that reduces housing quality and livability. Our business has done some major works in the past with community housing providers, helping them with maintenance schedules, and we've inspected a lot of them, and some of the things that are observed I would classify as subhuman. Some of that comes down to the underfunding of these assets. Some of it comes down to the destruction of the tenants as well, which kind of points to larger issues with mental health and being disenfranchised and that sort of thing. The fragmented governance, I think, is worth conversation as well. The division of responsibilities between different levels of government can lead to duplication or things falling between the gaps. So policy management is a problem. Targeting versus supply. So policies have increasingly focused on tightening eligibility, targeting just the most vulnerable people rather than expanding the supply. So if you kind of say, all right, we don't have enough homes for these people, and then you tighten the eligibility and suddenly it looks better on paper, but it doesn't fix the problem, that's created a bottleneck effect. And, many in need of affordable housing are actually excluded when those policies are tightened. And I think the big one, and probably something that people have picked up, is a passion project for myself, and something that we talk about on this podcast a lot, is the reliance on the private market, yet the way that the private market is being treated. So the system increasingly has been relying on the private rental market to meet demand through subsidies like Commonwealth Rent Assistance, which often fails to make rental housing affordable. But when we have so much reliance on private investors, yet state policies that disincentivise investment and, government, let's say federal rhetoric about, these evil, wealthy landlords, I think that really, really exacerbates the problem as well.
Mm. Do either of you know how the Commonwealth Rent Assistance works?
Not without showing exactly through my notes.
ChatGPT.
I
Jamie.
think, I don't want this to be recorded on the show, but I think it comes through with your benefit.
Yeah. With what do you mean with your benefit?
Commonwealth Rent Assistance, I think, is only available for people who are receiving government benefits.
Yeah. So you can use that to then subsidise your rent if it's going through.
It comes through as a rental subsidy, but I don't think it's available to people that are not on a government benefit.
Yeah, but this is reliance on the private market. So
that's right. Yeah. My brother-in-law gets his unemployment benefit. He also gets a rental assistance benefit. It's like a bolt-on to your dole money.
So look, there's certainly different layers to how the Australian social housing system works, and various challenges that you've just articulated, Mike. And we've certainly heard more about housing in this decade than other decades that I can recall, but it seems like it's a case of it's sort of too little too late, and the problems are big, almost gotten too big that there's no quick fix. So let's talk about the proposed and existing solutions. Cate, can you step our listeners through some of the proposed solutions and reforms that aim to tackle the social housing shortfall?
Sure. There's 5 that I've got on my list. The first is build to rent, encouraging institutional investment in long-term rental housing. Some models include provisions for a percentage of units to be reserved as affordable or social housing. Number 2 is the National Housing Future Fund. We've talked about this a lot. The federal government's $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund launched in 2023, and it aimed to deliver 30,000 new social and affordable homes in its first 5 years. However, critics would argue that this is not enough to meet the current and projected demand, and our findings from the most recent census certainly suggests and supports this.
I was going to say, not even critics, just free thinkers.
Blind Freddy, yeah. The next one's inclusionary zoning, so mandating that a proportion of all new housing developments include affordable or social housing. This policy is already used in parts of Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, but it does lack national application, which I think is part of our root cause. Community housing growth is number 4, expanding the role of community housing providers, which often deliver more innovative and tenant-focused models than state-run public housing. The last one's modernisation and redevelopment, replacing ageing stock with higher density developments, improving sustainability and increasing total dwelling numbers on public land. Now I'll come back to that. And the last one's policy integration, so aligning housing with other social services, including mental health, employment and aged care, to address the complex needs of social housing tenants. Now back to modernisation and redevelopment. I know from a Melbourne point of view, when you are driving from the airport, for example, you're coming through on that City Link and going past Flemington Road, you can see housing towers there. We've got housing towers all over Melbourne's inner ring, from Williamstown all the way around to, Albert Park and everywhere in between. But we've got a lot of these, I think they're dated back to the 1950s, and the plan is to replace them, to pull them down, because they've been considered to have reached their shelf life. And so from a safety point of view, they're looking at redeveloping. But even focusing on the new designs that they've got, they're not actually replacing the towers with the same density. It's actually going to be less, which means that some of the tenants that have been in those buildings will need to move. And I think that would be very hard for a lot of different people to be displaced from where you've been potentially for many years. And even looking at Ascot Vale as a bit of a case study, there's a lot of medium density, but a heap of it around Union Road, and they've had to displace people to knock down buildings and redevelop. So it's not an easy feat. And I also question whether the density being reduced is something that they've considered and got a solution for.
Yeah, so look, it's quite hodgepodge, really, isn't it? There's a lot of different ways it's being approached, but there doesn't seem to be any uniformity in terms of how it's being approached or the policies, let alone the definition across different jurisdictions, which makes it pretty hard to solve as a nation. So let's perhaps go to that final question for each of us, starting with you, Mike. What's your take on the crisis we're facing?
Well, I think it's a humanitarian failure at all levels, and we're really at a crossroads where we can do the business as usual stuff, and we can increase, the cycle of suffering in Australia amongst the most vulnerable, or we can do something about it. I think it's not more complex than that. When we talk about the mismatch between supply and demand, fragmented policy implementation, it's just contributed to a deepening crisis, and it impacts the most vulnerable that we have. There's lots of initiatives out there, and some of them show a lot of promise, but they really do need to be scaled up and embedded in a coordinated long-term national strategy, which is something that I think the housing market has really suffered from, with all of the state kind of intervention that just kind of shifts people around the country as they duck and weave, the anti-landlord sort of policies. And the private rental market has been broadly doing a really, really good job. And I think the recent rise in rents is not necessarily a failure of the private rental market. It's a sign that, states have put their toe across the line for too long and disincentivise that private rental market, which just exacerbates the housing issues that we have amongst the most vulnerable. So I think we need sustained investment, structural reform, and cross-collaboration across the states and territories to get to where we need to be. And, without that happening, we're just going to be talking about this in 10 years' time.
What are your thoughts, Cate?
Yeah, if only it was easy to solve, but it's not. And I lay blame at the feet of our governments that have backed off social housing and funding it for decades. They've moved taxes around and reallocated things, and they've let this just be a private housing market problem. And then they've got themselves confused and tried to punish landlords after they've set up the system that they're now saying they want to change. It's going to be costly to change it, really expensive. And I'm concerned that until our state and territory governments are aligned, it's not going to be a successful mission.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like it's an area of policy that successive governments have just allowed to drift over many years. They haven't seen it as a vote getter, and it's got to a point where it's a bit of a shambles and a mess, and people are paying a significant price because of this. I mean, my starting point would be to define what is affordable housing in Australia, so it does have a common meaning across jurisdictions and government programs. As you both sort of alluded to, it's pretty hard to sort this out if we have different meanings across different states and we have different programs trying to address the issue. And then my 3-point plan, I had a little bit of a think about this, would be number one, I'd undertake a full review seeking feedback from all the stakeholders with the goal to work out how can we simplify and standardise an approach, how do we minimise duplication, and how do we align policies. Once we've done that, step two, find all the unused public housing and set up a pot of money to fix them to be livable and set them up for use, and ensure there is an ongoing budgeted allowance dedicated to the maintenance and repair of all the properties across the country. And then step three, decide the number of houses in the country that we want dedicated to social housing. It sounds as if 4% is too low currently, and based on some of the numbers Mike shared and some of the OECD numbers, perhaps, and the level of the waiting list, perhaps 6% should be the goal, but let's decide what the number is. And then once we know that number, we can then figure out how many properties we need to build to get to that 6%, and then how many we need to build year on year based on population growth. That would be my plan.
Vote one, Dave, for Housing Minister. That is awesome. If only someone had stood up and articulated, and I'm not suggesting that you haven't put loads of work into it, but how simple is it? You've just taken something so complex and difficult and got a very, very simple 3-point plan overview. I love it.
Thanks,
and I really
Cate.
loved
Thanks to all your research, by the way. I've taken that from your
Sunday
prep for
reading.
the episode. That was my
Pleasure.
taking.
You know what you've said that really resonates? Having a pot of money that's dedicated to maintenance, because it's heartbreaking seeing these properties just boarded up and rotting. And as an investor, I know that I need to be prepared to do an overhaul on a property on a pretty regular basis. If it's really well maintained, you might get away with 20 years, but it's generally 15. And I'm talking new kitchen, new bathroom, maintaining the timbers, painting it. That's what it takes to manage a property. And I can hand on heart say that I have not seen social housing managed like that.
Yeah.
Well, there's state legislation that states that, say, strata titled properties have to have their sinking fund or the capital works fund updated, at least every 10 years. I mean, do public housing even have a maintenance plan or a maintenance budget? It sort of begs the question. I think
Clearly
some
not.
community housing providers do. I know that for a fact because we've been involved in doing some of them. But the state government, I mean, there's a strong argument to say they've never had anything like that. Otherwise, why would we have derelict buildings or buildings that are out of operation because of maintenance and repair?
Yes.
I think when
agreed.
there's so many disparate organisations, jurisdictions, ways of tackling the problem, you're going to have slippage, aren't you? You're going to have these types of issues, and you can't resolve them until we have a much simpler approach that's consistent across the country.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you so much, Cate, for your research for us for this episode, and Mike also for what the research you've done on top of Kate's wonderful outline for today's episode. So before we wrap up, let's go to our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
My gold nugget is, let's think about the COVID response and how we had the federal government working with the states. It's the first time I can really remember seeing, the federal government and the state governments coming together. I mean, I used to hear a lot about the COAG meetings, right, where they achieved some sorts of things, depending on what it is, I'm not sure. But I really do think we need to go to battle stations. We need to have a national cabinet again to address this issue, because we're talking about vulnerable people, their quality of life, which feeds into their well-being, their mental health. And that becomes a cycle that if we're kicking the can down the street, as the population grows, we're just dealing with a bigger problem down the track. So I think there is actually an opportunity cost to get ahead of this rather than continue to do the bare minimum and have people falling through the cracks.
I think we need a bipartisan approach, and that has to be signed on, because if this is just a 4-year term thing where the figures keep changing and the commitment isn't solid and uniform, this will not change. And this is a revolutionary policy that needs to take place. And I think along the lines of your 3-year plan, Dave, identifying how many houses we need to deliver, what space of time, what maintenance bucket we have, how to tighten all of the states and territories so that we have one national focus. Not an easy thing to do, but without bipartisan support, it will not get off the ground.
Yeah, so along those lines, bipartisan support, you set up an independent body, so it's not actually political, that operates federally and follows my 3-step plan, starting with an agreed definition.
The Johnston plan, we'll call it.
Yeah. And then it needs to work alongside, social assistance areas for those who potentially struggle to maintain a house that they're living in themselves. And, there are those types of difficult challenges because of people with, real extreme social, mental health issues and who've been through significant trauma. So there is some significant complexity in here. But it's obviously a worthy cause and is positive for everyone in our country if we have the entire population being able to put a roof over their head.
Yes.
I agree with you, Cate. We need to get it outside of the election cycle. And every year we hear, a budget announcement for social housing, because there's always something that they can do. They do tend to announce something that pushes us forward. Obviously, it's not meaningful enough. It should be something that we commit to over a 10-year time horizon rather than just something that we're shifting here and there every year. But it's an interesting point in politics we've got now as well, with the coalition being disbanded yesterday. I mean, typically we're looking at governments that, have a 3 or 4 year term, but Labor actually has an unprecedented opportunity to legislate in the next little while. The Liberal Party is in shambles at the moment.
We've got a bit of work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fixer-upper. They need as much maintenance as I think as our social housing stock does at the moment. But it is actually a rare opportunity to legislate some of this stuff. So it'll be interesting to see if the Labor Party do take that opportunity and push some things through. Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Well, we'll wrap it up there. It's been a really informative and insightful episode. I've certainly learnt a lot. So thanks to you both, and look forward to seeing you next week.
See you next week. Bye.